You're tuned in to Spotlight on the Voice of Russia.
And now our final topic, lessons from history start at school, or British historical amnesia.
The way history is taught in British schools has always been a contentious subject for debate. However, it's not only the way it is taught that seems to be debated by politicians, educationalists, journalists and teachers alike, but also what is being taught in the first place and for how long that attracts the most attention. Many simply believe that history is taught badly in the UK.
At the moment, this vital subject is not a compulsory one for children beyond age 14, and they are not obliged to take an examination in it. Kids don't show any interest in history, and some find it a boring subject. The Telegraph states too many children were finishing compulsory education lacking the most basic knowledge of the past because existing syllabuses have been stripped of core content.
A study in The Guardian revealed that following the release of data from one major exam board, only a tiny minority of children specialize in Britain's past as part of GCSE history. Some 48% of children who study the subject focus on the American West, while 44% studied Germany and the rise of Hitler between 1919 and 1945. Only 8% study British history.
Many Britons are convinced that it has no practical use in their day-to-day life. What is the purpose of remembering when the Irish potato famine happened, or when Britain lost the American War of Independence, if I live in a world where food is in abundance and America is our best friend?
It could be argued that it is highly unlikely that it will be asked about the beginning of Walpole's administration or the consultation of barons and townsmen during their job interview. Equally, there are very few chances that it will be quizzed about the Battle of Waterloo during a social party or a high society event.
However, it's exactly this assumption and dangerous misguidance on the importance and relevance of history as a subject in school which constitutes the source of the poor formation of some young Britons' mentality and intellectual development. Arguably, it could be said that it is a factor behind the general feeling of young people's sense of alienation and lack of political involvement in the society where they live.
History is fundamentally a very practical discipline. When it is taught properly, it teaches how to analyze, assess information and how to think critically. The government announced that it is planning to revise the national curriculum in history in an attempt to modify the content yet again. However, some prominent British figures say it is not about tinkering with the content, it is more on the structure and delivery of it that the government should focus.
Educationalists Jerome Freeman and Tina Isaacs wrote in their work, The 11 to 19 Curriculum and Qualification, a lot of students emerge from their study of history without a sufficiently confident overview of the past. They are quite good at knowing certain topics in great depth, but not how all the bits fit together, making the programme of study feel rather disjointed.
Instead of a highly detailed curriculum of excessively specialized fragments, depriving children of broad understanding of the great themes of history, a clear, connected and chronologically coherent framework is being advocated. A think tank, Politeia, as stated by the Telegraph, has published a study lessons from history, freedom, aspiration and new curriculum, and it proposes a simple legal framework whose aims are greater simplicity, greater freedom, greater coherence, greater transparency, less manipulation and less interference.
It advocates a broader curriculum, which will allow more freedom for teachers to teach, and that history should be a compulsory subject until 16, and should be properly examined too. The study states that the current system is flawed and does very little to encourage children to learn history. In 3 words, excessive specialisation, unnecessary detail, or over-concentration on dubious techniques and repetition are the stumbling blocks on the road of effective history teaching in schools.
Additionally, experts highlight that the present rigid emphasis on drilling in and testing of supposed historical skills do no favours in promoting love and passion for history among young people. They say that genuine historical skills arising from knowledge and understanding of the past should be an inherent part of historical study, not a separate artificial exercise.
Just to remind you, we're talking about history lessons and British historical amnesia.
You're listening to Spotlight on the Voice of Russia.
A history of a person's illnesses is the first thing the doctor looks at before diagnosing any current disease or prescribing any necessary treatment. Of course, he can prescribe the cure without knowing this history, but the chances are that the treatment will be more accurate and holistic if he has seen such a document. In the same fashion, the history of a nation is something that puts this nation on the map, and inside a context, it provides a perspective on problems of the present.
And now we talk to Professor Jonathan Clark. He was on the Politeia panel which produced the article. He's a very distinguished professor of English history. Professor, do you think it's important to know history?
It's important for the people to understand their own history, because otherwise they don't know who they are. It's as if they were suffering from the mental condition known as amnesia. A loss of memory means that we as individuals cease to be able to operate in the world, and equally a country, if it loses its own history, becomes a very different place. It becomes out of control, as it were. It's as if you're running a car and then you forget how to operate the car.
Why are pupils failing to study British history at school?
It's the same everywhere in the world at the moment. It's not just in Britain. There are two problems. First of all, people tend to assume that events in the past are more important the nearer they are to the present, and therefore they cease to reach back into the past to understand the whole sweep of a country's history. And the second problem is specialization. Historians in universities specialize on shorter and shorter time periods, and this is also a fashion in schools to look at shorter and shorter time periods.
What can be done to improve the situation?
Yes, I think it is important to change the method of teaching, but it's also very possible to do it. As soon as you sit down to try to plan a syllabus for a country's history that extends from the earliest times to the present day, shall we say, you realize that although it's a problem that can be solved. And I designed a syllabus over a 4-year period that stretched from the Roman invasion of Britain to the present. That's a long tract of time, but it can actually be got into 4 years of 3 terms each, and it can be taught, I think, to British school children. I'm sure the same could happen in Russia.
And that was Professor Jonathan Clark. He was on the Politeia panel which produced the article. He's a very distinguished professor of English history.
If history is forgotten and all traces are erased, then knowledge can't be passed on from generation to generation. The nation risks losing its identity, together with its past. And with its identity, it will lose its values, traditions and beliefs. History is what made us who we are today. It is like a solid functional wall people can lean on during difficult times. Use it to connect with experiences of previous generations. Most importantly, understanding what integrity means requires history, a reference in time and space, or there is a risk there will be nothing and nowhere to integrate. How can you teach citizens to be responsible if they don't owe their past? Or perhaps the government does not want people to know where they come from and what is their essential culture. Are they only pretending?
Often in Victorian England it was argued against teaching the law orders to read, because it was unnecessarily strain on their energies. So long as they could read bits of their Bible, they would need no more. People don't need to understand why they live the way they do. They just get on with it and let the upper classes take the decisions. Perhaps this is why the British electoral system tends towards an elective dictatorship to make decisions in Parliament.
No matter how painful some moments of British history might have been, including continuous conflicts with continental Europe over hegemony, dreadful plague years which saw British drinkable waters severely contaminated, wars of the British Empire, the slave trade, opiate wars and the enrichment of British state, and the Falklands War, all these historical moments matter. Why? Purely because there is always a chance that history will repeat itself, and as a popular saying goes, he who is forewarned is forearmed. And now we hear from Polina Boyka. She has lived in England since she was 4 years old, and she studied history at an English school.
I'd just like to point out that I grew up in the UK from the age of 4, so I've spent many years explaining to my Russian parents and relatives what it is we do in school in Britain. For many years my stories were met with looks of confusion. Don't they make you recite things off by heart, they'd shout, and why don't you know the exact dates of the blockade of Stalingrad, for example? But after a certain point they suddenly understood. A British education teaches a student to learn independently. Their approach is to provide a student with the analytical tools to learn rather than provide factual knowledge. Of course, there are definitely two different schools of thought. Many say that the Russian education system provides much more factual knowledge, a more comprehensive understanding of history. In my experience, all the people that I've met with a Russian or a Soviet education have been extremely well-rounded individuals with a wide breadth of knowledge. There isn't such an emphasis on facts in the British system. For example, in a history exam, even at GCSE levels, which is the exams that 16-year-olds sit in the UK, a student can't be awarded top marks without providing their own personal interpretation of a historical event.
And that was Polina Boyka. She studied history at an English school.
And with that, we've come to the end of today's program. Thank you very much for listening. My name is Maria Ushakova.
And my name's Ian Sumter. Thank you.
And goodbye.